On December 10th, 1997, a 23-year-old woman named Julia Butterfly Hill pulled herself 180 feet up the side of a massive redwood tree in Northern California. Her original plan was to spend 1 week on a makeshift wooden platform that was attached to the trunk of Luna. That was the nickname given to this 200-foot-tall redwood tree by Earth First activists who wanted to prevent its logging by the Pacific Lumber Company. But instead of just 7 days, Hill ended up living in the canopy for an incredible 738, all while enduring helicopter flybys, nonstop bugle and air horn noise, and even frostbite. According to Hill, the end goal of preserving Luna and the surrounding grove more than justified the challenges. Not, as she explained to a local radio station at the time, because we want it all, but because all that's left is so little. In the end, her 2-year tree sit worked. Both Luna and the nearby groves were preserved, thus ending one of the last battles for the majestic redwoods of California. Now, what could possibly inspire such intense devotion to a tree? Well, I have an inkling. You see, as it turns out, I actually have my own personal connection to the redwood forests of Northern California. I was born in Arcata, a small town of less than 20,000 people located along the Pacific coast in remote Humboldt County, about 40 miles north of Luna. Growing up, I was surrounded by redwoods, the most magnificent trees on earth. I like to think of them as the alpha species of the forest world. The ocean has its whales, the savanna has its lions, and the forest, well, the forest has its redwoods. But not just any forest. For the tallest trees in the world grow only in a narrow strip of land not far inland along the central and northern coasts of California. Here, in Humboldt and Del Norte counties, the last surviving old growth continues to stand as tall and proud as ever, up to nearly 400 feet high and 2,000 years old. The Redwood National and State Parks were designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1980, the same year I was born. In this lecture, we will explore the fascinating history and ecology of the redwoods. We will also highlight the role these giants have played in the development of the communities of Northern California. But unlike many of the sites we've visited in this series, I can't talk about the redwoods without reflecting on my own personal experience growing up among them. In fact, some of my earliest memories in life are of walking through a silent redwood grove, looking up to see the sky, only to find that there was no sky, because the tallest trees on the planet had blocked it out entirely. So I hope as I bring this course to a close, you'll bear with me as I tell the story of the redwoods and how they have intertwined with my own. Ancestral redwoods have been around since at least the extinction of the dinosaurs some 65 million years ago. Back then, a warmer and more humid climate allowed for a variety of distantly related trees to flourish across much of North America, Europe, and Asia. But around 3 million years ago, as the climate got colder, these ancestral relatives died out in most parts of the world. The genus Sequoia simply can't survive in harsh winter climates. So the world's tallest tree took refuge in what are now the coastal regions of Northern California. This region offered perfect conditions for the finicky coast redwood. Rainy, mild winters with only the rare frost, combined with moderate summer temperatures with lots of wet fog. Since redwoods are capable of transpiring up to 500 gallons of water per day, a reliable source of precipitation throughout the year is essential to replenish this redwood sweat. That makes a coastal habitat ideal, but not too close. Redwoods need a buffer zone between themselves and the salty spray of the ocean, or they'll get dehydrated. As a result, the redwood is endemic to a narrow strip of land about 5 to 40 miles inland from the Pacific coast, generally below 2,500 feet in elevation. Their range starts a little bit north of Monterey Bay to just past the border with Oregon. about 450 miles along a north-south axis. At the time of European contact, this range probably encompassed just under 2 million acres of old-growth redwood. Today, however, about 95% of this has been logged at least once, meaning that only 75,000 acres of original old-growth forest continues to survive. Now, with the right conditions, coast redwoods can soar to astonishing heights and live to a mind-boggling age. They are, hands down, the fastest-growing trees in the world. By age 20, redwoods are often 30 feet tall with a 10-inch diameter trunk. And then they really start to grow, between 2 to 6 feet per year, with an additional inch of diameter added to their trunk. A mature redwood is anywhere from 500 to 1,000 years old, stands 200 to 300 feet tall, and boasts a trunk of 6 to 20 feet in diameter. Old photographs often depict a group of 8 to 10 adults attempting to link arms and wrap themselves around a redwood trunk. But it's their height that really grabs the headlines. The tallest ones can top out at 380 feet high. Not only that, but they can also live to more than 2,000 years old, weigh 1,000,000 pounds, and sport a 16-foot wide trunk. Just think, a few of these majestic giants will have first sprouted up out of the soil right as Pompeii and Herculaneum were being buried by ash and fire. One of the most striking aspects of a leisurely stroll through an old-growth redwood grove is just how dark and quiet it is. Animal life that would normally thrive within earshot is instead another 200 feet up in the distant canopy. And you can forget about direct sunlight. The only thing of any radiance is likely to be the aptly named banana slug, which thrives on the forest floor and always caught my attention as a child. But the redwoods are not the only giants of the forest. They are also its most hardy veterans. In fact, until the advent of modern logging technology, it was really hard to kill a redwood for good. There are 3 major lines of defense. The first is their thick, stringy layer of bark, which can be up to a foot thick in the largest redwoods. This natural armor makes it easy for redwoods to resist forest fires. Most of the time, the worst a fire can do is burn the base of the trunk. This allows fungi to get inside and rot some wood. Then the next time a fire comes around, its flames can burn a little further inside the base. But this combined assault of fire and fungi does not kill the tree, even when it manages to burn out a cavity extending 100 feet high inside the trunk. It merely creates what are known as goose pens, cavernous hollows of these still living trees that attract both bats and early white settlers, who gated them up and put livestock, ducks, or geese inside, hence the name. Now, anything that breaches the thick outer layer of redwood bark has to deal with its heartwood core. This part of the tree is extremely resistant to disease and insects. In fact, less than 50 insects even attempt to feed on a redwood, compared with the several hundred that feast on a Douglas fir. And none of these can do much damage. Perhaps the most remarkable symbol of the redwood's tenacity, however, is its propensity for reinventing itself in creative ways. In the unlikely event of a traumatic injury, mature redwoods can sprout new shoots from dormant buds. And if a redwood does happen to be toppled in its prime, its stump will send up hundreds of genetically identical shoots. Eventually, these will thin out into a circular fairy ring of successor trees. Left to its own devices, it seems, a coast redwood never truly dies. But of course, no tree this magnificent would ever be left to its own devices for too long. In the year 1769, a Spanish colonial official by the name of Gaspar de Portala, while searching for Monterey Bay, spotted what he referred to as, quote, very high trees of red color, not known to us. Before long, the Franciscan missionary Father Juan Crespi coined the name Palo Colorado, or redwood. The Portala expedition camped near a particularly tall redwood, which they named El Palo Alto, or the Tall Pole. This arboreal celebrity is still living today. The city of Palo Alto named itself for the tree, and its image is emblazoned on the crest of Stanford University. Now, back in the 18th century, the Spanish didn't have the technology capable of harvesting many of these southern redwoods. But those that they did manage to fell were soon integrated into the architecture of Spanish missions. Father Juan Crespi was even buried in a redwood coffin. When it was exhumed a century later, word was that the coffin was in far better shape than the padre inside. In 1848, the California gold rush broke out, and with the promise of instant riches, hundreds of thousands of immigrants flooded into the American West. For most of them, it was a gold bust rather than a gold rush. But there was another way to get rich quick. All they had to do was walk into the forest and look up. This sequoia gold, as redwood lumber soon came to be known, was far more ubiquitous than yellow gold. The more populated, more accessible redwood groves of Monterey and San Francisco were logged first. Once depleted, investors began to look further afield, toward the rugged North Coast. Since there was little chance of transporting million-pound redwood trunks hundreds of miles overland, these early logging efforts concentrated on areas that were close to maritime transportation routes. And this is where the story of my life intersects with that of the redwoods. You see, I was born in the Mad River Community Hospital, on the northern outskirts of the town of Arcata. The Mad River has its headwaters in the Coast Range Mountains of north-central California. And as it approaches Arcata and its bay, the Mad River flows through what was once pristine old-growth redwood country. In the days before mechanized transport, rivers like this were essential to the logging industry. Even so, nothing came easy in these early decades. To work as a lumberjack on the rugged north coast of California was to risk your life on a daily basis. When I attended kindergarten at Jacoby Creek Elementary School, I was blissfully unaware of all the broken limbs and crushed skulls that once littered the banks of the waterway that my school had been named after. Case in point, a Humboldt County newspaper report for July 25th, 1907. It read as follows. Yesterday was quite disastrous to woodsmen, for besides the Elk River fatality and the breaking of the leg of Bob Dunnigan at Jacoby Creek, a logger named Kane suffered a compound fracture of the left leg by being struck by a flying Beckett in the Vance Woods. In addition to courage, logging the redwoods took both brains and brawn. A mature redwood could take 2 to 3 days for a pair of lumberjacks to bring down. And that was just the beginning. In order to get these giants to a sawmill, the trunk was cut into multiple sections, each about 16 feet long. Now, in the earliest days, a team of oxen would pull these sections over a dirt path that was grooved with horizontal crossbeams and lathered in grease. This was the original skid row, designed to prevent soil erosion while allowing for the swift transport of massive timber. Well, swift by mid-19th century standards, about 2 miles per hour. By the 1880s, however, an entrepreneur named John Dolbear invented the steam donkey. With the aid of steam-powered winches and steel cables, it could pull up to 15 logs at once in an elaborate mechanized operation. Not surprisingly, this invention paved the way for the first lumber barons to make their fortunes. Many of them reinvested these profits in ornate Victorian homes in Arcata and Eureka, the 2 towns built alongside Humboldt Bay. Perhaps the most famous is the Eureka mansion of William Carson, who partnered with John Dolbear in the booming 1880s. Before long, Carson's company was producing 15 million board feet of lumber per year. To give you a sense of the economic value of these North Coast redwood groves, consider this. In the 1980s, when I was growing up in Arcata, a single redwood could yield $100,000 in profit. That's twice the value of the home I grew up in. Now, from the fourth story of their magnificent mansions, men like Carson could quite literally watch their Sequoia gold floating into Humboldt Bay, which was connected to the Mad River by a canal. Once in the bay, the redwood was processed by one of several mills that lined its shores before shipping out onto the ocean. When I was just a toddler, my dad worked at the Sierra Pacific sawmill on the north end of the bay. I still remember growing up hearing tall tales about his grueling shifts at the mill, coming home filled with splinters and losing 60 pounds after 6 months of back-breaking work. As I later learned, these tales may not have been all that tall. 19th century lumberjacks who chopped away at the redwoods were known to consume up to 8,000 calories per day. That's 4 times as much as an adult male who doesn't come home with a handful of splinters. What I didn't realize at the time, however, was that the wood my dad was processing at the sawmill in the 1980s likely came from nowhere near Arcata. By then, nearly all of the surrounding redwood groves had already been clear-cut at least once and sometimes twice. It's a reminder of the boom and bust cycles that plague any community that depends on forestry for its livelihood. In fact, the street that I grew up on, Buttermilk Lane, was in all likelihood the aspirational embodiment of a diversified economy that looked beyond the lumber industry. As it turned out, that diversity came instead from the establishment of Humboldt State University in Arcata. Go Lumberjacks! But still, that wasn't enough to keep my parents around, and when they got their degrees, we left the redwoods behind. Like the hardy lumberjacks before us, the Jacobs moved on. This time to Seattle, where it was just as wet and gloomy, but without those noble giants of Humboldt County. Now, by the time I was a teenager, I had a lot of nostalgia for the redwoods of my youth. In the year 2000, I decided to use my spring break at college to fly down to the North Coast and hike the redwoods. Now aware that the redwoods I grew up with around Arcata had been second or third growth, this time I targeted bona fide old growth. And in order to do that, I had to venture into redwood national and state parks. Now, interestingly enough, it is the state parks that do the lion's share of preserving the redwoods, though for a slightly perverse reason. When California attained statehood in 1850, all of its land, including the redwoods, was declared public domain. But in 1878, the state government encouraged settlement of the rugged North Coast by passing the Timber and Stone Act. For just $2.50 an acre, the average Joe could obtain his own little slice of redwood heaven. But because the real commercial value of this land was about $1,300 per acre, shady investors recruited phony buyers to purchase land on their behalf. The phony buyers got $50 for their role in the fraud, while the investors got the world's most magnificent trees for mere peanuts. By the turn of the 20th century, nearly all redwood land was held in private hands. Now, fast forward some 40 years, and many urban philanthropists began to decry the disappearance of the redwoods. The Save the Redwoods League, founded in 1918, led the way. Through fundraising efforts and political activism, it was able to purchase limited sections of redwood forest on a grove-by-grove basis. Over the course of the 1920s, the state of California agreed to consolidate these groves into 3 state parks: Prairie Creek Redwoods, Del Norte Coast Redwoods, and Jedediah Smith Redwoods. Unfortunately, due to the patchwork nature of acquisition, none of these parks were contiguous to one another. I learned this the hard way. Having flown into Crescent City, I naively assumed that I could hike straight through Del Norte Coast and into Prairie Creek. I was wrong. Instead, hiking the redwoods proved to be a frustrating experience. One moment you're gawking at eye-inspiring old-growth groves. The next moment you're dodging cars while walking along the shoulder of Highway 101. But once off the asphalt, the redwoods never fail to inspire. Now, everyone has their favorite parks and hikes, I suppose, but my favorite was Prairie Creek Redwood State Park. My parents have a picture of me as a toddler, sitting on my dad's shoulders in front of the prairie next to the parking lot. When the Save the Redwoods League bought up these old-growth groves in the 1920s, they inadvertently saved this prairie as well. Many decades later, it served as a refuge for California's nearly extinct elk population. Now the elk have rebounded and can be found throughout the park. You'll almost certainly encounter a few of them while hiking through some of the more than 75 miles of trails throughout the park. You'll also pass by a good number of memorial plaques and benches, many of which pay tribute to the donors who helped preserve these groves in the first place. If you're pressed for time and can only choose one hike, I'd recommend the James Irvine Trail. A gentle hike among old-growth giants, the James Irvine Trail eventually connects to Fern Canyon. The canyon is a shallow stream flowing between two walls covered in hanging ferns, so prehistoric in feel that it was used as a backdrop in the 1997 sequel to Jurassic Park. In fact, ferns are a staple of redwood forest, often covering both the forest floor and growing on limbs hundreds of feet up high in the canopy. It was nice to get back to my redwood roots on that hike through the state parks. But as enchanting as the groves of Prairie Creek State Park were, I still hadn't seen the tallest of what the North Coast could offer. 6 years later, opportunity knocked. In 2006, I decided to pursue a PhD in Chinese history at UC San Diego. As my newlywed wife and I packed our bags and drove south from Seattle, I couldn't resist the temptation to make a detour to the Redwoods. This time, however, I was going to regale my wife with the tallest trees on Earth. And for that, we would need to venture into the national park. In fact, it was precisely the search for the world's tallest redwood that finally succeeded in galvanizing the federal government into action. In 1963, Paul Zoll, a naturalist working with the National Geographic Society, set out to identify the tallest redwood as a means of reinvigorating the movement to establish a national park. His search led him to privately owned land near Redwood Creek, not far to the south of Prairie Creek State Park. After endless measurements from the ground, Zoll finally found it. After several readings from different points, he later recalled, I came to an astonishing figure. Much as I wanted to believe my rough computations, I simply could not. According to the Abney level, this was easily the world's tallest tree, about 370 feet. Actually, it was 367.8 feet tall, enough for National Geographic to put it on the cover of the July 1964 issue, with the title, Finding the Mount Everest of All Living Things. Before long, the Sierra Club added its support and undertook lobbying efforts in Washington, D.C. It reminded the president that any nation wealthy enough to put a man on the moon could surely save the Earth's tallest trees. And these efforts bore fruit. In 1968, President Lyndon Johnson formally oversaw the creation of Redwood National and State Parks. Now, about half of the new park consisted of the 3 extant state parks, while 80% of the newer half was a mix of old growth and second growth in the Redwood Creek drainage basin. This was where my wife and I took our memorable stroll through what is now known as Tall Trees Grove. Like everyone else, though, we could only admire these giants from a distance. But wouldn't it be incredible to see the top of a redwood from within the canopy itself? Believe it or not, this was the goal of Humboldt State University biologist Stephen Sillett. By using a crossbow tied to fishing line, Sillett shot his arrow over the lowest branch of the redwood. That usually comes at around 200 feet up, or about 25 stories high. He then replaced the fishing line with a rope, a pulley, and a harness. And away he went. In 1996, Sillett became the first person to ascend into the mysterious redwood canopy, eventually climbing twice as high as Julia Butterfly Hill. Now, much to everyone's surprise, Sillett soon discovered that the redwood canopy was a world unto itself, far different from the branchless lower half. The transformation begins with what are known as reiterated trunks. These are branches that suddenly bend upward at sharp angles in order to exploit gaps in the shade or restore a wounded section of the tree. Sometimes they end up fusing back into the main trunk or with another reiterated trunk, creating complex geometric shapes. Reiterated trunks can even have their own reiterated trunk. But what's really cool about them is that they themselves can be larger than a standalone tree, while still attached to the main trunk of the original redwood. For instance, the Del Norte Titan, an ancient redwood in Jedediah Smith State Park, has a reiterated trunk that sprouts off from the base 107 feet above the ground. This new trunk then rises itself for an additional 156 feet above that. In its crown, the Del Norte Titan has another 43 reiterated trunks, which together comprise nearly 10% of the total wood volume of the tree. Another behemoth, the Redwood Creek Giant in Tall Trees Grove, has the most complex canopy of all, a whopping 148 reiterated trunks on a single tree. Even more fascinating, if that were possible, are the elevated platforms and crotches that these reiterated trunks create. With so much additional mass and surface area, some reiterated trunks can collect enough organic matter to produce up to 6 feet of soil in the canopy. This in turn gives rise to an entirely new ecosystem, one that's suspended more than 200 feet above the ground. Stephen Sillett has documented a diverse array of wildlife that thrives in these unlikely ecosystems. This includes salamanders that can live their entire lives in a redwood canopy without ever touching the forest floor. Ferns, which are ubiquitous on the redwood forest floor, have also managed to climb up into the canopy. Even other trees can sprout out of a reiterated trunk. The Redwood Creek Giant, for instance, has a California bay tree growing out of one of its knotholes at 322 feet up in the air. Today, the tree that helped inspire the creation of Redwood National Park is no longer the world's tallest tree. This shouldn't surprise us, since there are some 75,000 acres of protected old growth left along the north coast. Most of them have not been measured. For now, the new title holder is Hyperion, which stands at 379.1 feet and is located not far from Tall Trees Grove. Like most celebrity redwoods, the exact location of Hyperion is concealed by park authorities in order to prevent overzealous admirers from trampling its roots. Perhaps Hyperion is a metaphor for our relationship with UNESCO World Heritage Sites around the world. That is, even if we never get the chance to see them in person, still they remind us of the endless ingenuity and wonder of both nature and humankind. But they also serve as a warning, not just of the consequences of neglect or exploitation, but also the consequences of too much love. In the end, I think the ultimate significance of the redwoods, much like Paleolithic cave art, Persepolis, Thingvellir, Easter Island, Mount Fuji, and so many other World Heritage Sites, is that they symbolize something bigger than ourselves, that there is some sort of continuity between past and future that transcends our own fleeting existence. And yet at the same time, they provide the vivid tapestry against which we live out our own particular lives. Our interactions with these sites are what gives them renewed meaning across generations. So much so, in fact, that a little boy who once liked to run around in Arcata's Redwood Park would, a quarter of a century later, feel compelled to take his wife on a hike to see the world's tallest tree. It's that enduring grip on our minds, the unforgettableness of it all, that makes UNESCO's World Heritage Sites so special. There are well over 1,000 of them out there, and I hope this series has inspired you to get out and explore them. For World Heritage is truly the heritage of each and every person in this world. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you've enjoyed this course.